America-China feud has begun. Is China an expansionist country? One well-accepted fact about Xi Jinping is that he reneged on his promise not to militarize the South China Sea islands. In December 2016, the Wall Street Journal reported, for a man who stood at the White House in September 2015 and promised not to militarize the South China Sea, Xi Jinping is sure doing a lot of militarizing. In two of its articles, The Washington Post wrote that China routinely makes commitments that it does not keep. Just remember Xi Jinping's 2015 promise to then-President Barack Obama not to militarize the islands it created in the South China Sea, and again that Xi Jinping broke his promises to President Barack Obama not to militarize the 7 Chinese-made islands in the South China Sea. The Economist was perhaps the most forthright in its accusation of Xi Jinping's broken promise, declaring in an article in April 2018, less than 3 years ago, Xi Jinping stood with Barack Obama in the Rose Garden at the White House and lied through his teeth. China absolutely did not. Mr. Xi Jinping stated that he intended to pursue militarization on its islands. If Xi Jinping had indeed made such a promise and retracted, it would only go to confirm a widespread belief in the West that China has become aggressive and expansionist. It would also confirm a belief that the Chinese are being perfidious and deceptive when they claim that China will rise peacefully. So what is true? Few Americans can claim to know China as well as Ambassador Stapleton Roy. Born in China, a fluent Mandarin speaker, Roy also served as the American ambassador to China from 1991 to 1995 and has stayed exceptionally well informed on U.S.-China relations. He explained what happened, in a joint press conference with President Obama on September 25, 2015, Xi Jinping had proposed a more reasonable approach on the South China Sea. Xi Jinping had supported full and effective implementation of the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, signed by China and all 10 ASEAN community members, and had added that China had no intention of militarizing the Spratlys, where it had engaged in massive reclamation work on the reefs and shoals it occupied. Roy said that Obama missed an opportunity to capitalize on this reasonable proposal. Instead, the U.S. Navy stepped up its naval patrols. China responded by proceeding with militarization. In short, Xi Jinping did not renege on a promise. His offer was effectively spurned by the U.S. Navy. The big question is how an untruth becomes accepted as a fact by well-informed Western elites. And this is not easy to answer. Most of the widely accepted untruths about China get generated and spread virally by the medias and the newspapers of the world. Major Western newspapers are bold and largely independent. No government has the power to control their reporting. Indeed, they often stand up to and confront their governments with inconvenient facts. As a result, when they report stories, a high degree of credibility is justifiably associated with them. Yet, it is also true that these newspapers must rely on government sources for some of their stories, including intelligence services like the Five Eyes Network America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Many of these stories are credible. For example, it is a fact that Xi Jinping did offer to not militarize the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, and for the record, he did not offer to demilitarize the Parasil Islands, which are disputed with Vietnam only. It is also a fact that the Chinese military did subsequently step up its activities in the Spratly Islands. The missing unreported fact is that the U.S. Navy provoked the latter reaction. For obvious reasons, this fact was not shared by the Five Eyes Network. Historically, China has been clumsy at explaining or defending its points of view. Given the rigidities of the Chinese political system, it is hard to find a good spokesman who can, with humor and sharp insights, explain the Chinese perspective effectively. One surprising exception to this rule is Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei. He has spoken directly to many leading Western media outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, Bloomberg TV, Time, CBS, and BBC. He speaks with great authority and clarity, using direct and striking language, when by contrast, many official Chinese spokesmen use slogans. Yet, if China were to try to make a case that it is inherently not a militaristic power, it would have many strong arguments to deploy. The first argument is historical. If Chinese civilization is inherently militaristic, this militaristic streak, especially the desire to conquer and subjugate other territories, would have surfaced long ago. Over the past 2,000 years, China has often been the single strongest civilization in the Eurasian landmass. If China was inherently militaristic, it would have and should have conquered territories overseas, as the European powers did. Future historians will, for example, marvel at the fact that even though Australia is geographically close to China, it was physically occupied and conquered by far more distant British forces. This Chinese reluctance to conquer Australia and other overseas territories is not because China always lacked a navy. Yet, quite remarkably, China did not conquer or occupy any overseas or distant territories. Singapore's former Foreign Minister George Yeo remarked that throughout Chinese history, the Chinese have been averse to sending military forces far away. Most of China's territorial expansion, like Inner Mongolia or Xinjiang or the rugged mountain regions, took place when China was ruled by foreign dynasties, like the Yuan, 1279 to 1368, and Qing, 1644 to 1911. The story of Tibet is more complex. Tibet was first conquered by China under the Mongols in 1244, but enjoyed considerable autonomy under Yuan dynasty. In the many centuries since this initial conquest, struggles have ensued over Tibet's domination by the different Chinese governments, from the Qing to the Republican government. It was only in 1950 that Tibet was formally incorporated into the People's Republic of China. China's claims over Tibet therefore come with a highly contested history. This is a simplification of a rich and complex Chinese history, but the significant grain of truth is that for most of the past 2,000 years, the Han Chinese have not been militarist or expansionist, despite the many wars they have fought, most of which were within China. The relatively peaceful streak of the Han Chinese people is brought out when their behavior is compared with some of their neighbors. One of the most powerful and terrifying imperialist expansions in human history was carried out by China's immediate neighbors in the north, the Mongols. Led by the brutal and dynamic Genghis Khan, these relatively small Mongolian tribes, far smaller in population than the Chinese people, conquered not just China but almost all of Asia, becoming also the only East Asian force to threaten an invasion of Europe. Yet the more powerful Chinese empire never emulated this conquering example of its neighbors. The Mongols conquered and ruled China itself for over a century. As a result, there was massive cross-fertilization between Mongolian and Chinese culture. In this process, the Mongols could have transferred their militaristic culture into the software of Chinese civilization. Instead, the opposite happened. The Chinese progressively civilized their Mongol rulers, and while Kublai Khan fought wars with China's neighbors, he made no effort to conquer the world like Genghis Khan tried to do. What was the powerful anti-military DNA of Chinese civilization that eventually infected Mongol rulers? It probably goes back to Confucius. The Chinese have long had a saying that just as good iron is not transformed into a nail, a good man is not made into a soldier. At several points in the Analects, Confucius cautions against people who only have the strength of soldiers. In one dialogue, Zilu said, "Does the Junzi image prize valor?" The master said, "The Junzi gives righteousness the topmost place. If a Junzi had valor but not righteousness, he would create chaos." If a small person has valor and not righteousness, he becomes a bandit. In another dialogue, Zilu said, "Master, if you were put in charge of the 3 army divisions, then whom would you wish to have with you?" The master said, "Those who fight tigers with their bare hands, wade across rivers, and are willing to die without regret. I would not want their company. I would certainly want those who approach affairs with fearful caution and who like to lay careful plans for success." In contrast to American culture, where there is a strong built-in reverence for the man in uniform, Chinese culture has revered scholars more than soldiers, even though there are military figures who are celebrated in folklore and literature for their patriotism and loyalty. One harsh fact needs to be spelled out clearly here. In recent decades, America's first option when confronted with a strategic challenge has been to use a military option, while, in reverse, the Chinese tend to avoid military options. As Henry Kissinger explained, the foundations of China's distinctive military theory were laid during a period of upheaval, when ruthless struggles between rival kingdoms decimated China's population. Reacting to the slaughter, and seeking to emerge victorious from it, Chinese thinkers developed strategic thought that placed a premium on victory through psychological advantage and preached the avoidance of direct conflict. Kissinger has accurately distilled the essence of the advice given by China's master strategist Sun Tzu, who once said, "All warfare is based on deception. Pretend inferiority and encourage his arrogance. For to win 100 victories is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill." This does not mean that the Chinese are incapable of fighting wars. Over the past 2,000 years, they have fought many wars with many neighbors, especially when they were ruled by foreign dynasties, and they have gradually expanded their territory to occupy vast spaces. Although China has occupied some neighboring territories, it has also learned to live in peace with many of its neighbors with whom it has fought many wars, including 4 wars with Myanmar, 2 wars with the Japanese, 3 wars with the Koreans, and 7 wars with the Vietnamese. Indeed, it is quite remarkable that China has accepted the independence of Vietnam because Vietnam was occupied by China for 1,000 years, from 111 BCE to 938 CE. The Chinese have also learned the art of losing wars gracefully, if its neighbor accepts the ritual of apologizing to the Chinese emperor for defeating an invading Chinese army. This is clear while reading history. So, while the Vietnamese had from time to time defeated invading Chinese armies, they had always, thereafter, sent emissaries to Beijing bearing tributes to apologize for having defeated the Chinese invaders. It is argued that the real mistake that Vietnam made in 1979 was not defeating China but failing to apologize to China for defeating it. As China becomes more and more powerful, it will, like all great powers, assert its power and influence. Just as America's neighbors in Latin America had to adapt and adjust to American power as it exploded in the late 19th century, China's neighbors will also have to adapt and adjust. But China will not resort to military means as its first expression of power. This is why Graham Allison wisely reminded his fellow Americans to be careful in wishing that China would be more like them. He said, "The long 2,000-year record of Chinese history clearly shows that China is fundamentally unlike America as it is reluctant to use the military option first. It is also fundamentally different from America in another regard. It does not believe that it has a universal mission to promote Chinese civilization and encourage everyone else in humanity to emulate it. Americans fundamentally believe that they should stand for universal values and sincerely believe that the world would be a better place if the rest of humanity absorbed and implemented American values." Hillary Clinton said in a 2016 speech, "When we say America is exceptional, it means that we recognize America's unique and unparalleled ability to be a force for peace and progress, a champion for freedom and opportunity. Our power comes with the responsibility to lead, humbly, thoughtfully, and with a fierce commitment to our values. Because, when America fails to lead, we leave a vacuum that either causes chaos or other countries or networks rush in to fill the void. The Chinese believe the opposite. They believe that only Chinese can be Chinese in culture, values, and aesthetics. This universalizing streak of American culture may explain why America has gotten involved in so many military conflicts. Both Gaddafi of Libya and Assad of Syria were and are deeply flawed rulers. Yet, America is several thousand miles away from Syria and Libya. It has no vital national interests in either country. But because of its universalizing vision, it felt a moral obligation to get involved militarily. The Chinese are genuinely puzzled by this. Why get involved in foreign military conflicts when it doesn't serve one's own national interests? The Chinese are even more puzzled that America has allowed its involvement in unnecessary Middle East conflicts to undermine its more fundamental national interests. Such involvements have drained resources and taken away the possibility of using the same resources to improve the lives of relatively poor Americans instead. The Chinese are privately delighted because each unnecessary involvement in a Middle Eastern conflict reduces American ability to deploy resources against China. Having seen the folly of wasteful American military involvements, the Chinese have learned one wise lesson: refrain from getting involved in unnecessary fights. It is not an accident that China has not fought a major war in 40 years and has not fired a bullet across its borders in 30 years. This lack of military action reflects both a powerful civilizational impulse and a deeply pragmatic view of power. Having carefully refrained from using military options for over 4 decades, the Chinese are genuinely bewildered by the American portrait of China as an inherently aggressive, militaristic, and expansionist power. As a result of this strong conviction that China is becoming militarily aggressive, the American security establishment, including the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the FBI, has concluded that China is now a direct threat to America. In September 2019, the Department of Defense reported the remarks of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy John C. Rood as saying that it is not an exaggeration to say China is the greatest long-term threat to the U.S. way of life, but China also poses the greatest challenge to the Defense Department. A month later, Vice President Pence made several remarkable allegations that China's military behavior has become increasingly provocative over the past year, arguing that China has regularly menaced and strong-armed its ASEAN neighbors in the South China Sea, while provoking Japan in the East China Sea and using the BRI to establish footholds in ports around the world, ostensibly for commercial purposes, but those purposes could eventually quickly become military. In the deeply polarized political atmosphere of Washington, D.C., in early 2019, it was almost impossible to get a broad-based political consensus on any topic. Yet, even in this deeply polarized environment, a strong consensus developed among the American political, security, and intellectual establishments, involving both Democrats and Republicans, that China had emerged as an aggressive military competitor to the United States. Above all else, America is known to be a rational society, with many competing points of view debated all the time. Yet in Washington, D.C. today, it is virtually impossible to make the case that China is not a military threat to America. It is plain to see that defensiveness, in the form of securing China's national borders and sovereignty, is the emphasis of contemporary Chinese military policy. This defensive line of thinking is evident in China's Defense White Paper, published in July 2019, which emphasizes safeguarding national sovereignty and territorial integrity as part of its defensive national defense policy. Kevin Rudd, who has a deep knowledge of China's history, has explained well the emphasis on defensive postures in China's strategic thinking. He writes, neighboring states occupy a particular place in China's strategic memory. Historically, they've been the avenue through which China's national security has been threatened, resulting in successive foreign invasions from the Mongols in the north in the 12th century, to the Manchurians in the northeast in the mid-17th century, to the British, French, the Western imperial powers including the United States, and then the absolute brutality of the Japanese occupation from the east. In Chinese traditional strategic thought, this has entrenched a deeply defensive view of how to maintain China's national security. But Chinese historiography also teaches that purely defensive measures have not always succeeded. The failure of the Great Wall of China to provide security from foreign invasion is a classic case in point. For these reasons, modern Chinese strategic thinking has explored different approaches. First and foremost, through political and economic diplomacy, China wishes to secure positive, accommodating, and, wherever possible, compliant relationships with all its neighboring states. Citing Chinese initiatives like the BRI and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Rudd concludes that the strategic imperative is clear: to consolidate China's relationships with its neighboring states. And by and large, this means enhancing its strategic position across the Eurasian continent, thereby consolidating China's continental periphery. In other words, what American thinkers have labeled Chinese expansionism is more accurately explained by China's obsession, informed by its long and painful history of subjugation and invasion, with securing its borders by consolidating its relationships with its neighboring states. Moreover, although China has fought countless wars with Japan, Korea, Myanmar, and Vietnam, the prospects of any such war breaking out in the next few decades are virtually zero as well. Why? Since all the immediate neighbors have lived next to China for thousands of years, they have long developed sophisticated and subtle instincts on how to manage a rising China. And the Chinese elite, unlike the American elite, have a deep understanding of their long history with their neighbors. There will be many back and forths between China and its neighbors, accompanied by all kinds of sophisticated and subtle shifts. But there will not be wars. The one exceptional trigger for a war involving China is Taiwan. Most of the time, the Chinese leaders have a lot of policy flexibility. There are no strong domestic lobbies to worry about. But the one issue where the Chinese leaders cannot bend and compromise is Taiwan. Any Chinese leader, including Xi Jinping, despite all his power, could be removed if he is perceived to be weak on Taiwan. Why is Taiwan so fundamental to China? There is a very simple explanation. Every Chinese knows the century of humiliation that China suffered from the Opium War to 1949. Nearly all the historical vestiges of this century of humiliation have been removed or resolved, including Hong Kong and Macau. Only one remains, Taiwan. It was Chinese territory until China was forced to hand it to Japan after the humiliating defeat in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. The Chinese have been disappointed by the Western powers several times on Taiwan. At the end of World War I, when China thought it had worked with the Western powers, it initially received assurance from America and the British that Taiwan would be returned to China at the Versailles Peace Conference. But, under the Treaty of Versailles, the territories were awarded instead to Japan. The Western Allies turned out to have made simultaneous secret agreements with both China and Japan in order to bring them both in on the Allied side. China felt enormously deceived by the West at this conference. The failure to return Shandong triggered the massive protests that broke out on May 4, 1919. The May 4 movement holds a special place in Chinese memories. This history has taught the Chinese not to accept Western assurances. Any move by America or any other Western power to support, directly or indirectly, the secession of Taiwan from China brings back this historical memory. It provokes a strong, powerful and virulent national reaction, which boxes in any Chinese leader who may be trying to look for room to maneuver. America cannot claim that it doesn't understand the significance of Taiwan. It was clearly the hottest issue to resolve when Nixon and Kissinger began the process of reconciliation with China. Many clear understandings were reached between America and China. The most explicit understanding reached was that Taiwan and China belonged all together to only one country. The 1972 joint communiqué stated, the United States side declared, the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain, there is only one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. Since both Taipei and Beijing agree that Taiwan and China belong to the same country, it is also erroneous for any American to claim that Beijing's claims on Taiwan are proof that China is an expansionist, aggressive nation. The Chinese desire to reunite Taiwan with the mainland represents a restitution, not an expansion. Many Americans naturally believe that America is behaving responsibly on Taiwan because it is the main guarantor against an outright military invasion of Taiwan. This is true. Yet it is also true that it is the people of Taiwan who will suffer if American actions provoke military responses from China. If America's goals on Taiwan are truly noble, if it wants to protect the Taiwanese people, and if, in the long run, America wants to see the gradual emergence of a democratic China, it should allow the continuation of the only democratically run Chinese society in the world, which is Taiwan. The best way to preserve the democratic system in Taiwan is for America to leave Taiwan alone. It should also forcefully indicate that it will not support Taiwanese independence. This is the tough love message that President George W. Bush sent to the then Taiwanese leader, Chen Shui-bian, who was flirting with independence. And this tough love message worked. Might China invade Taiwan unilaterally and without provocation? There are two major constraints on China. It is actually in China's national interest to allow the continuation of a social and political laboratory to indicate how a Chinese society functions under a different political system, and there is a real convergence of Chinese and American interests here. China could learn long-term lessons from Taiwan on how Chinese people cope with democracy. It is also in America's long-term interests to have a well-functioning democratic society in Taiwan. In short, if political wisdom, rather than short-term tactical games, dominates Chinese and American decision-making on Taiwan, both sides could agree on Taiwan retaining its autonomy. Strong American discouragement of Taiwanese independence movements will help to reduce tension across the Taiwan Straits. Reduced tension across the Taiwan Straits will also help to reduce the pressure on the Chinese leaders to accelerate the reunification of Taiwan with China. In theory, China should be opposed to a policy of developing closer links with a free and democratic Taiwan, as it could lead to calls for a similar political system in mainland China. Nevertheless, it is truly remarkable that all the recent governments in China have gone out of their way to both increase and facilitate greater contact between the mainland and Taiwan. When relations between China and Taiwan improved from 2008 to 2016, the numbers increased significantly to 3.6 million Taiwanese tourists in 2016 and a peak of 4.18 million Chinese tourists in 2015. The big breakthrough happened in 2008 when China allowed direct flights for tourists. Flight times from Shanghai to Taipei were reduced from 5 hours to 2 hours. If Americans want to understand how relatively enlightened Chinese policies toward Taiwan have been, they should compare them with American policies toward Cuba. No American president had agreed to meet Fidel Castro when he was alive. By contrast, President Xi Jinping met President Ma Ying-jeou in Singapore in 2015. However, We do know that American naval vessels routinely carry out naval patrols 12 miles off Chinese shores. Under international law, the U.S. Navy, and other navies, is perfectly justified to sail 12 miles off Chinese shores. These patrols are not inherently provocative, but the manner in which these patrols are carried out can be. America justifies its aggressive naval patrolling in the South China Sea on the grounds that it is protecting a global public good, freedom of navigation in the high seas. The irony about this American claim is that the biggest beneficiary of the global public good that America is protecting is China. China today trades more with the rest of the world than America does. More Chinese products sail across the world than American products do. There is a total convergence of interests between America and China on this global good when it applies in 99.99% of the world's oceans. In conclusion, during the next decade or two, China will probably emerge as the world's strongest power, without becoming an expansionist one. 2,000 years of Chinese history have created a strategic culture that advises against fighting unnecessary wars in distant places. The likelihood therefore is that, while China's strategic weight and influence in the world will grow significantly, it will not behave as an aggressive and belligerent military power. If the real competition between America and China will not take place in the military sphere. To be continued. For more, see the book Has China Won? By Kishore Ramabubani.